to our second Visiting Faculty Scholars of Color talk of this semester. This is a 4-talk series that Dean Andy Porter and I collaborate on and have been doing so for the past 5 years. But Andy has actually had this series in every place that he's been a faculty member, and it has been ongoing since the early 1980s. So the speakers that we bring as a part of this series really enter into a rich legacy of scholars of color who given this talk. It's a very prestigious talk, and today is no different. So I mentioned that Andy and I have been doing this for 5 years. Each of those times, though, Andy has had the pleasure of introducing the speaker. But this time is different. I wanted to, and it was very important for me to have the opportunity here to introduce today's scholar. We met 6 years ago, actually. Well, I met her before she met me, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. But from that initial encounter, I had no doubt that Professor Kimberly GRIFFIN would become one of the most visible, well-respected, and impactful early career scholars in the field of higher education. I could have easily predicted from my first encounter with her that she would win a Dissertation of the Year award for her outstanding study on Black faculty and mentoring relationships at UCLA, where she got her PhD in higher education and organizational change. I could have also predicted that she would win a handful of honors from the American College Personnel Association and other higher education groups, and that she would earn tenure at 2 major research universities, Penn State and University of Maryland, where she presently teaches, in just 4 years upon completion of her PhD. It surprises me not that Dr. GRIFFIN's 38 publications include articles in the American Educational Research Journal, Teachers College Record, the American Journal of Education, the Review of Higher Education, and other top refereed academic journals in our field. While I knew that she would become a professor who cares deeply about research, student mentoring, and teaching, I must confess that I did not expect that Kimberly would have such an enormous impact on our field in such a short period of time. Kimberly's very first publication, so here's the story of how I met her before she met me. Kimberly's first publication was a single-authored article in the Journal of College and Student Development, which has a 9% acceptance rate. This was my introduction to her. So here's this rock star grad student at UCLA who had written a single authored article in a journal that rejects 92%, 91% of the things that are submitted. I knew this girl was going to be a star, no doubt. I was immediately impressed by the substance of the article and its methodological rigor. I've since gotten to know Kimberly very well and have developed an even deeper appreciation for her enormous contributions to the study of mentoring Black students and faculty and high-achieving students of color. Those are the topics that she studies. Like that first JCSD article, everything of hers that I've read is important and impressive. Kimberly has chapters in 4 books that I've edited. She and Walter Allen worked with Sylvia Hurtado and me on the Ash Reader on racial and ethnic diversity. And 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of co-authoring an article with her that is published in Harvard Public Policy Journal. At this point, little about Professor GRIFFIN's scholarly and service contributions, mentoring relationships with students, and stature in our field surprises me. It therefore pleases me to introduce her to each of you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good job. I want to take a moment to say thank you so much to Dean Porter and to Dr. Harper for inviting me to participate in this speaker series. I'm honored and thrilled beyond belief to be here today, and thank you so much for such a thoughtful introduction. I'm a little bit moved, but I'm going to push forward and try to say something important and interesting today. And I'm really just excited to chat with you folks today about some of the ideas that I've been thinking about over the last few years and about which I'm really passionate. The title of my talk today is Aligning Agendas, Reconsidering Connections Between Excellence, Mentoring, and Faculty Diversity. So this kind of talk is a little bit new for me. Rather than presenting some research that I've already presented or one big comprehensive study, I'm going to talk a little bit more conceptually, and I'm going to pepper findings of various studies I've worked on throughout my presentation today, so hopefully you'll indulge me a little bit. I hope to cover a lot of ground in our time together today, but I just want to give you a brief overview of where we're headed. First, I want to talk a bit about two issues of interest and concern in higher education: faculty diversity and student excellence and success, suggesting that there are benefits to discussing how they're intimately related to one another, rather than framing them as separate discourses. Second, I'll discuss how mentoring can be a bridge between these two topics and can better promote better outcomes in both areas. However, the third point that I'd like to make will complicate our perspectives and understandings of what mentoring is and how it does what it does. I'll present some conceptual and theoretical applications that have the potential to foster better understandings of these relationships, hopefully presenting new opportunities to foster our ability to better meet faculty diversity and student success goals simultaneously. And then finally, I want to leave plenty of time for us to have some discussion about how to bring these areas together in theory, thought, and in practice. So, if you'll indulge me, we're going to start with a bit of an audience participation exercise. First, I'd like you to take a look at this image. So look at it for about 5 or 10 seconds. Okay, got it? All right. So, now I'd like you to take a look at this image. Look at it again for another 5 or 10 seconds. Okay. Now look at both pictures together. How are these pictures similar and how are they different? It's not a rhetorical question. Anybody, how are they similar and how are they different? Yes?
There aren't very many scholars of color or people of color.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes?
There are older white males in the photos.
Great. Yes?
There are I think a lot more men than women.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes?
One shows them in community, the other is.
That's a really excellent point. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. So, first of all, who are these people, right? Who are these random folks that I'm sharing with you? You're looking at the same group of faculty 30 years apart. So, on the left, you have the Stanford University faculty in the psychology department in 1981, and the same faculty is pictured on the right in 2001. So, in the interest of full disclosure, these are the faculty who trained me. I was an undergraduate at Stanford University. I graduated in 1999. I got my bachelor's degree in psychology. And I could say with pretty good certainty that if there was a picture in between in 1999, you would see pretty consistent pictures across the whole thing, right? So when you think of your undergraduate institutions or you think about your graduate programs, a lot of times I think if we took photographs and took snapshots, they would look very similar to this, right? And you're right, there are some changes, right? So some folks saw like, okay, well, the later picture, you might see a few more faculty members of color, you might see a few more women, but for the most part, both pictures are dominated by white males, older white males, right? So if we were just to look at these two pictures, we may think that over the last 30 years, the Stanford University faculty in psychology really hasn't changed all that much, right? Fair assumption to make. So while someone could certainly say, well, that's just Stanford, that's just the way that they do things, this story is actually replicated in the national demographics that when we look at faculty trends over time. It would be unfair to say that there's been absolutely no change. This graph shows that the diversity in the faculty at US institutions between 1975 and 2009 has changed somewhat over time. If we look at the percentage of faculty that is white, it has indeed decreased, and the proportion of the faculty represented by people of color is indeed increasing. However, it's important to note a few things. First, let's focus on the 4 bars on the left. Change has been slow and largely driven by increases in the number of Asian American and international professors, which are marked by the yellow and the blue bars. The percentage of the professoriate that's composed of Black, Latinas, and Latinos and Native Americans has seen small and slow levels of growth in the past 35 years. So in 1975, 5% of faculty were Black, Latino, or Native American. More than 25 years later, they still represented only 8.5% of all faculty, and by 2009, the representation of faculty from underrepresented groups had only reached 9.5%. Right? So over a pretty good period of time, we're seeing very little change. Now, if we look at these 2 bars here on the right, we can see that the slow rate of change in the professoriate lags far behind changes that we've observed in the student body, as well as in the US population in general. So considering the demographic projections and the rapid growth in the Latino and Asian American communities, we're moving towards campuses that are less and less likely to look like the nation and the communities that they actually serve. Right? So this is the first problem that we're dealing with, that there's a general lack of diversity in the faculty, and the professoriate certainly has not changed to reflect the US population or the student bodies that they serve. So the second problem I'd like to discuss today actually dovetails with this issue that I just discussed. The number of students entering higher education is growing, and communities of color are growing most quickly on many college and university campuses. So based on data from the most recent ACE Minorities in Higher Education Report Supplement, there was a 54% jump in enrollments of students of color between 2000 and 2009, and a 14% increase in the number of white students on American college and university campuses over the same time frame. Right? So we do see these communities growing and growing at a more rapid pace. However, attention has been increasingly called to whether these individuals are completing degrees and succeeding at the same rates. So let me preface my presentation of this second graph by saying that I know that it masks the diversity within groups, and it may give us a somewhat skewed notion of achievement across groups. I know it's by no means perfect. However, but I think it's a really good jumping off point for the conversation that we're going to have today. This graph represents the percentage of 25 to 29-year-olds that earned a bachelor's degree in 2009 within each population, right? And the blue graph is the average across all groups, so at about 30%. So if we looked in 2009 at all 25 to 29-year-olds, 30% of them would have bachelor's degrees. So while the first graph suggests that students of color are growing in terms of enrollments, Black, Latino, and Native American students are still less likely to finish with their bachelor's degrees. Although close to 60% of Asian American and 36% of white adults between the ages of 25 and 29 have bachelor's degrees, 18% of African Americans, 12% of Latinas and Latinos, and 10% of Native American adults report the same level of educational attainment. These statistics have been identified as an area of national concern and have pushed the completion agenda that's been advanced by many leaders and policy organizations. There's been a renewed emphasis on students completing college degrees and certifications, perhaps best represented by President Obama's goal for 2020, that the US would have the highest proportion of college graduates in the world. The pressure that institutions are under to see better rates of completion and certification, particularly in communities of color, and the desires to see students adequately prepared for the workforce may not really be all that new. Like we've seen that push over a long period of time. However, in addition to these more standard measures of success, there have been increasing calls to make sure that students are educated and are successful in getting writing and critical thinking skills, as well as cross-cultural competencies to train the next generation of the workforce to understand and resolve complex problems and engage in meaningful ways in our increasingly global economy. So we have these two problems, right? We have a faculty that isn't as diverse as we would like for it to be, and we have inequitable rates of excellence and achievement across student groups, as well as a push to expand our notions of what it means to train students to be successful in today's workforce. I think it's fair to say that there are extensive literatures and institutional initiatives that are meant to address each of these problems in isolation. I've rarely seen people try to tackle these issues in tandem or discuss the similarities between the issues and strategies to address them. In many ways, however, I think there's overlap between these two topics, and that we can leverage the similarities in our challenges in promoting faculty diversity and student success that will allow us, as a field of practitioners and of scholars, to better address each of these problems and perhaps make progress and reach goals that could not be attained by addressing one or the other in isolation. In my talk today, I'd like to argue the following. Diversity in the professoriate and greater representation from minority populations will allow us to better train, support, and educate our students. And conversely, better educated and more well-supported students will create a pipeline towards a more diverse faculty. Further, I'd like to suggest that mentoring and developmental relationships can serve as a bridge between these two topics. Scholars have spent decades studying this topic, and I think many of us in this room could certainly speak to the ways in which mentoring has promoted our own personal success. However, I would also suggest that our study of mentoring has been limited by a lack of clarity, and in some cases, a lack of complexity. And by understanding what happens within mentoring relationships in new and innovative ways, I think we can develop and promote new initiatives that would allow us to engage in work that fosters faculty diversity and success simultaneously. So, how do we begin to align narratives of faculty diversity and student success and excellence? Where do we even begin with this conversation? Conceptually, I almost immediately think of Mitch Chang's work on this topic. He wrote a paper in 2000 where he discusses how efforts to improve racial dynamics on campus are often stalled by a series of competing interests, right? Have folks read this paper before? Yes, classic paper. If you haven't read it, you need to go out and find it. He highlights one tension that's relevant to my talk today: access and diversity versus excellence, right? He talks about how discussions about increasing diversity in higher education are often resisted by individuals who assume that you can't do that without reducing quality, right? That policies that focus on making higher education more diverse and equitable diminish academic standards. So I love Mitch for this. First, he talks about how these assertions are first based on racism and stereotypes about the abilities of students of color, right? So we should be neglecting them for that reason. But also, they talk about how this perceived conflict is resolved by reconceptualizing what excellence actually means, right? Such as addressing some of the critical thinking and cross-cultural competency outcomes that I mentioned a little bit earlier, right? That we can't actually have excellent campuses without them being diverse, because that learning needs to take place. These ideas are well represented in discussions about inclusive excellence. You see a definition from Denver University here on the screen. And IE suggests that diversity and success are dependent on one another, right? That our institutions really are only successful when they promote equity and achievement across all populations through institutional strategies that are both long-term and comprehensive. So while Chang's work and notions of inclusive excellence speak to these issues broadly, I think that they apply as we try to bring together discourses about faculty diversity and student excellence, and can serve as a useful backdrop for the conversations in which we're about to engage. So I'd like to briefly address how faculty diversity can both improve student success, and then how student success can address efforts to diversify the faculty, all within this context of notions of inclusive excellence. First, let's look at how diversity in the professoriate promotes better outcomes for students and student success. In my read of the extant work and my own research, I would suggest that there are three core ways that this can take place. First, while promotion and advancement structures may not actually reward these activities, faculty of color seem more likely to engage in some of the learning practices and pedagogies that have been linked to the highest rates of learning and development among students. According to studies by scholars like Jeff Milam, Anthony Antonio, and Paul Umbach, faculty of color are more likely to engage in active learning strategies, student-centered pedagogy, and various forms of curricular innovation, which can promote critical thinking and other forms of learning. And they're also more likely to spend time and engage students outside the classroom, which can lead to a whole host of wonderful learning outcomes that we'll discuss in more detail later on in this talk. Secondly, faculty of color can provide unique perspectives in the classroom that push students to develop the skills necessary for success in our increasingly diverse workforce and global economy. We often focus on the learning that takes place between students, right? The learning that takes place when you engage with someone from a different racial or ethnic background than your own, or that has a different perspective than your own. But work has also shown that faculty of color are more likely to talk about issues of equity, issues of race, issues of gender in the classroom, and that learning across difference can take place in that venue as well. So that by having faculty members of color in the classroom, you can actually facilitate learning related to increased cultural competence in a way that we haven't really paid as much attention to. And third, faculty of color play a unique role in educating students who are underrepresented and marginalized in higher education. Researchers like Allen, Patton, our own Dr. Harper, Guafrida, and Fries-Britt have written about the unique relationships students of color have with faculty of color and the ways in which they promote their sense of belonging and achievement, particularly at predominantly white institutions. I've given some attention to this third dimension in my own work, examining the unique ways in which faculty of color and Black faculty in particular contribute to the educational experiences of Black students. So in a paper called Voices of the Other Mothers, which will appear in the Journal of Negro Education, I explored the unique relationships Black faculty members had with their Black students. I interviewed 28 Black faculty members employed across 2 large, predominantly white research institutions. And my work would suggest that there are both academic and psychosocial strategies that Black faculty employ when working with Black students that make these relationships relatively unique. First, the academic parts of it. Black professors support their students generally, so they almost always preface their conversations with, I love my students, I support my students, I really spend time with all of my students. However, what I found most interesting was that they were able to draw on their own experiences and knowledge of the academy to direct the path of their Black students in very unique ways. In many ways, they use language similar to what Black parents have long used with their children, noting that they had to be twice as good to get as far as their classmates. So what we see in this quote from a female professor, she acknowledges the unfairness and the reality at the same time of this different standard Black students are being held to. She also notes the importance of helping students get to a place where they would be perceived as good students and scholars in spite of the ways that they've been marginalized. My data also showed that Black faculty had personal relationships with Black students that were outside of the norm of their other relationships. So in this quote, we see again words that indicate Black students are like members of faculty members' extended family. And this faculty member felt like it was part of his role to advise his student in a more personal way than he did with his other students, to the point that he loaned him money. So it was really interesting to sit here and watch this faculty member reflect on the fact, like, yeah, I loaned him some money at one point in time, right? Like, that he felt that personally connected to the student and his investment in him was that significant that he would loan him money to make sure that he could stay in school. And this faculty member felt like it was part of his role to advise this student in a more personal way than he did with his other students. Other participants didn't necessarily go to these extremes, and there were several stories of Black faculty, however, and particularly Black women, who directly addressed students' personal issues that could potentially influence their success and achievement in ways that they perceived as unique, and that they did not necessarily see their scholars emulating. So this is maybe a unique contribution that faculty members of color are making to the students of color that they work with. Okay, everybody with me? All right. So let's look at the other side of the coin now. How can we attend to student success in ways that are consistent with notions of inclusive excellence relating to increased faculty diversity? Right? This may be hard to think about if we only focus on one dimension of increasing faculty diversity, retaining individuals in faculty positions, right? So there's definitely a wealth of research that focuses on how do we keep the faculty of color that are in their positions, right? How do we get them to promotion and advancement and all those other wonderful things? However, in my mind, principles of inclusive excellence are critical in promoting diversity in the professoriate in a longitudinal sense, creating a pipeline of people from a variety of backgrounds who are not only able, but are interested in pursuing faculty careers. So there are three main ways I can think of that we can go about this. You can increase access to graduate education, you can increase retention in graduate education, and you can increase interest in the professoriate amongst graduate students, right? I'm in the midst of a line of research that addresses the strategy in this lower right quadrant. How can we address students' interest and access to the professoriate, right? All thinking about notions of inclusive excellence. I recently presented work on this topic at the Association for the Study of Higher Education National Meeting with Dr. Kenneth Gibbs, who is an immunologist and a fellow at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And we decided to focus on initiatives to promote diversity in the professoriate in STEM, and in biomedical sciences in particular, because the numbers were even more disheartening than the ones I shared with you at the beginning of my talk today. A report from the National Academies noted that despite some successes in increasing diversity in undergraduate and graduate student populations over the last 20 years, efforts to diversify the faculty have been relatively unsuccessful. Indeed, despite receiving 12% of all degrees in biomedical sciences, faculty from underrepresented backgrounds represented 2% of basic science faculty. 2. Okay. While no one fully understands why increases in student representation haven't translated to faculty diversity, part of the problem may be related to student interest, which declines during graduate school. However, we don't have an understanding of why or what happens during students' learning experiences that might translate to this decline, right? So we really don't know the answer to these two questions at the bottom of the screen, right? How do people actually make decisions, and how does graduate education influence the decisions that they're making? We decided to conduct a study where we asked a diverse sample of PhD completers questions about exactly what shaped their career decision making. In phase 1, we conducted 11 focus groups with 39 individuals, just to get a general overview of how people's interests changed over time, focusing particular attention on how their interests shifted during graduate school and during their postdoctoral training if they indeed decided to pursue that route. So if I asked many of the folks who are actually in charge of developing policies and programs to increase diversity in the professoriate, particularly if they're focusing on STEM, why the workforce generally, and the faculty specifically, isn't more diverse, I think that they would give me the following response. So this is the dominant discourse that they would give us. That they would talk about this lack of ability and a lack of competence, right? They would discuss the challenges presented by the STEM college curriculum from individuals from underrepresented groups, and they would focus on new learning opportunities to address those challenges and those issues, right? While these things certainly matter, I would argue that their conceptions of this process are incomplete. Based on the data we've collected, a focus on skill and efficacy negates attention to issues of climate and interest, which can have particularly negative implications for women and for men from marginalized groups. We propose an alternative discourse grounded in principles of inclusive excellence. The individuals that we talked to in our research who had already completed their PhDs could be talented scientists and faculty. But what our work and work of others is telling us is that people generally, and women and people of color specifically, are less likely to choose academic careers. And when we asked them why, it wasn't about their ability. First, women generally, and women of color in particular, noted that the ways in which their learning experiences were less inclusive and validating than their male peers made them less interested in being faculty members. At times, this could challenge their self-efficacy, even though they thought that they were able scholars. And people weren't making decisions based on their ability. They were making decisions based on what they observed the academy to be, and what they expected their training and lives to be like if they entered it. So they engaged in learning vicariously and determined that they did not want to be part of a reward system that didn't validate the work that was important to them, negated the importance of work-life balance, and valued narrow discoveries and publications over addressing significant pressing problems. So while we have an inkling of what's going on here, the findings from the focus groups led me to this string of questions. What would it mean to rethink how we promote student success and increase interest in the professoriate among students? What if we directly address the differences in students' learning experiences, creating more equitable climates and learning experiences, and address their perceptions of what it means to be a professor? And by promoting student success, could we, in fact, increase diversity in the professoriate, increasing the number of students from different groups that are interested in staying in academia rather than pursuing alternative careers? Okay, are there any questions thus far? People all right? Okay, cool. So, I've argued that there are certainly areas of shared interest and overlap between discourses related to student success and faculty diversity. You believe me a little bit? You're on board with that? All right, cool. All right. So, I would like to suggest that research and practice, which focuses on mentoring, can be effective in simultaneously promoting faculty diversity and student success goals. So why mentoring? Mentoring for me is this natural choice, right? First, it involves both students and faculty. But I also have a personal investment in this topic, and my research and mentoring in many ways may be an effort, like all of us academics, to better understand my own experiences, right? We all engage in this me search and trying to understand, like, how did I get to where I am? So this picture that you see on the screen is obviously of me, but also with Jeff Milam and Sharon Friesbrett, the day I got my master's degree from the University of Maryland, right? So my first little foray into academia. This picture is important to me for a lot of reasons, but there are a few ways in which it's really relevant to the conversation that we're having today. First, for me, this picture speaks to the power of mentoring, promoting student success and faculty diversity at the same time. I can speak at great lengths about what these two people did and continue to do for me as a scholar. Through our relationships, their classes, and their feedback, they taught me how to be a better thinker and what it meant to be a researcher. They taught me that access and equity research was important and valuable and validated my interest in it. They were models of what a professor could be and moved me from saying, I want to be just like Sharon, but not a professor, to maybe I can be a professor like them because they believe in me. So my success as a student, my training and ability to enter the workforce as a well-trained professional, my critical thinking skills, and my confidence in my own abilities translated to my interest in being a faculty member. And my entry into the academy is checked in some box somewhere as adding diversity to the faculty, first at Penn State and now at the University of Maryland. And hopefully my presence translates to success for a new generation of students. That is, if I can do as good a job and be as brilliant and supportive of my students as these two were for me. And in many ways, the literature aligns with my personal experience. We have a good bit of literature and research supporting the importance of these relationships and their connections to positive outcomes. If we think about student success, there's a wealth of research that suggests that my experiences aren't so unique. Relationships between faculty members and students creates opportunities for students to be socialized into the norms and values of higher education generally and their disciplines specifically. We see a whole host of improved learning outcomes associated with these relationships, including critical thinking and cognitive complexity. We see academic achievement and increased degree aspirations. And we also see associated psychological benefits, such as increased satisfaction with college experiences and increased sense of belonging. In terms of faculty diversity, there's a literature that suggests that close relationships with students can promote positive outcomes in terms of priming the pipeline and encouraging the retention of faculty members of color. So first, in terms of pipeline, mentoring is related to the growth, development, and aspirations of graduate students and can positively translate to increased interest and entry into faculty positions, right? But further, work by Baez, Reddick, and my own work considers what faculty of color can actually gain when they work with students generally and students of color specifically. This research highlights the ways in which working with students can help faculty fulfill what they may perceive as their purpose or their motivation. It may be their way to shape future generations of the academy, and mentoring can be personally fulfilling in a way that promotes to an increased sense of satisfaction with their work. So while I think it's really important to address the ways in which mentoring can serve as a bridge, I think it's important to note that our knowledge about mentoring, again, is incomplete and that it's not a perfect solution. In other words, this little bridge is a little shaky and it's kind of rickety in some of the places, right? And we need to understand those places. So for students, we have this sense that mentoring works, but research in this area has been largely theoretical. We don't really know how or why it works. We just know that it does. And also there's a relatively robust literature base that suggests that relationships that students of color and women have with faculty are very different from those that their white and male peers have. So while there may be benefits, not everyone has equal access to them. So while the fact that mentoring is translated to really positive outcomes for me isn't necessarily different, what's different is that lots of people who look like me don't have that level of access. And they don't get the opportunity to be educated by scholars who look like them and that uniquely understand their experiences. And in terms of faculty diversity, while there's a growing literature that suggests how students can be rewarding, there's also an extant literature that is more vast, which describes the professional challenges associated with these relationships. In an advancement process that values productivity largely above all else, working with students can be a time and energy-consuming distraction. Further, I'd like to suggest that mentoring responsibilities aren't really distributed equitably in the academy. I spent a good deal of time thinking and reading about this of late, and I think there are two things going on. First, there's racial differences that are largely related to volume. So we see lots of papers, lots of research talking about the fact that faculty members of color are sought out by students of color. They are advising and mentoring a larger group than their white colleagues may be. However, I think we've less considered how that racial dynamic can intersect with a gender dynamic. That we see a similar literature looking at women and their mentoring experiences, suggesting that women, some things around volume, but actually more related to the nature of the mentoring that they'll provide. That they'll provide more caring relationships, more personal relationships that may be more time consuming as well. So that when we look at race and gender together, we start to see that you have women of color being expected to do more in terms of volume, but also be expected to do more in terms of quality of the relationships that they'd have with students, which may be distinctive from their male colleagues. So despite these challenges, I think that mentoring can still offer some good opportunities to promote faculty diversity and student success. But to do so, I think that we need to reconceptualize and reconsider what we mean by mentoring. And a more nuanced understanding of mentoring will help us better leverage these relationships and reach our faculty diversity and student success related goals simultaneously. So I'd like to introduce you to the ways that we can rethink and better leverage mentoring by complicating 3 mentoring myths. But before I share my myths with you, what are some things that people often say about mentoring that you always hear, right? Like just little trite comments that people always make about mentoring. What are some things that you folks have always heard?
That's one way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the mentor who's giving and the mentee who's receiving.
Right. So the mentee gets all the benefits, right? They get all the good stuff. Yes?
That the mentor and mentee have to meet all day, every day, and hang out.
Exactly. That there's this one way to engage, right? And they're besties all over the place. Yeah.
That people just have one mentor, and that you now a network of mentors. You know,
Right.
just this one all-over mentor.
You need your person, right? And that's all you need. Yeah. Other folks? Yeah.
But it's short term, that you have a mentor while you're going through the education process, and then once you transfer into a workforce, you get like another mentor to help you through that type of part of your life. So it's kind of you kind of look at this mentorship as being kind of a short term solution for one part of your life.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point. Absolutely. Yeah.
That the mentee is becoming a carbon copy of the mentor.
Oh yeah, that's a really good one, right? Like we're all creating little mini me's running around. Absolutely. Other folks? Yes.
That mentors have to look like you.
The mentors have to look like you. Absolutely. Any other things? Okay, this is a really good list. I should add to the 3 that I put up here, but you've touched on some of the things that I plan to talk about today. So first, the first point, that mentoring benefits students, right? Second, that mentoring produces positive outcomes that are going to be uniform across everybody. And finally, that mentoring is an important behavior, right? So you may read these and think like, seem pretty straightforward, right? These are things that I would generally agree with. And I would assert that I don't really think these things are wrong, right? But I think that they're not complicated enough and they don't really address the different nuances in mentoring relationships that some theories and different conceptual ideas can really help us unpack and better understand so that we can avoid some rickety places in the bridge. So let's start with this first myth, that mentoring benefits students, and I think this dovetails nicely with the point that Dr. Harper made, right? That when we often think about mentoring in higher education, we think about this professor pouring information into student who is empty vessel, right? Like, I will sit here, I will receive information from mentor, it is completely to the benefit of the student, it is completely at the cost of the mentor, right? However, if we consider mentoring as a form of social exchange, right, which suggests that we don't engage with people because it's the nice thing to do, because it's the altruistic thing to do. We do it because we get some kind of benefit in return, right? That all of our relationships are a series of costs and benefits. Then when individuals interact with each other, it will be because they both have something to gain from that relationship, right? So that relationship is going to be reciprocal. It's going to be bidirectional, right? And that both people have something to gain, but both people have to give something up when they're interacting with each other, right? And to the extent that the benefits outweigh the costs, the relationship will continue. So if we put this within a mentoring framework, it isn't that mentoring doesn't benefit students, right? It can and it often does. But it also comes at some kind of cost, right? We have to remember that that student is an active member of that relationship and that they have something to give in exchange for what they're going to get. And further, it reminds us that the student is not the only person that we should be thinking about, right? Faculty have costs, which we know something about, and benefits, which we know much less about, that come from their relationships with students. So the second myth is that everybody is going to have the same outcomes from their mentoring relationships, right? Which reminds me more of like the idea that we're all going to be besties, we're going to walk around together, and we're going to have like wonderful fun times skipping through, the daisies, and it's going to be wonderful, right? And I would say that this assertion is partially correct, right? That having mentors is generally a good thing, but that's more of a quantitative question, right? It's a dichotomous, do you have a mentor, do you not? And I think the more important and more interesting question is a qualitative question, which starts to get at the nature of relationships between two people. What are you doing that has allowed you to be besties, right? Like, what has actually happened between two people? So while social exchange generally suggests that there's going to be benefits, there's another line of research within social exchange that focuses on structures of mutual dependence, which really addresses the ways in which our interaction is structured that suggests that benefits are going to come to people in very different ways. So the first form of exchange is a direct exchange, right? It's almost like a friendship. So if I'm sitting with Dr. Harper and we're chit-chatting, he may tell me about one of his problems for 10 minutes. I'll tell him about one of my problems for 10 minutes, and we'll just kind of exchange back and forth, right? Faculty members actually don't talk about having this type of relationship oftentimes with their students. That might come later on in their relationships. They in fact focus more on the next two forms of exchange I'm going to discuss, generalized exchange and productive exchanges. So generalized exchanges are marked by indirect reciprocity. So the first example I'm going to give is, this one was really hard for me to conceptualize, I know, initially when I heard about it, because it's like you give something to someone and you don't get something back from them directly, but you may get something in the future because you interacted with them, right? So if we think about the peer review process, right? When you submit a conference proposal, you know that someone out there in the world is going to review it, right? And that reviewer is going to read it, and they don't get anything back directly from reviewing it. However, when they submit a conference proposal one day, someone's going to review it for them, right? Because they've engaged in this process. Or maybe they're contributing to the field, and the field will be better because they reviewed this conference proposal, and people will go on to do great things, right? Same would be true of a mentoring relationship. So me guiding a student's dissertation may not directly provide a benefit back to me, but I see that student go on to do good things, and I feel good about that. I'm able to shape the academy in one way or another. That student is going to go on to mentor other students, right? So it's seeing benefits as being more indirect rather than direct. This third form of exchange is productive exchange, where it's not necessarily about the interactions between two people. It's about creation of a third resource that everyone can benefit from, right? So I think we naturally think of collaboration when we think of something like this. So if I sit down with Dr. Harper and we read a paper together, right? We have a relationship, but it really wasn't about the relationship between the two of us. It's about writing this paper that's going to ultimately benefit both of us, right? So if we think about these three forms of exchange, right, mapping on to actual mentoring behaviors and things that happen within a relationship, the different forms of reciprocity would mean that there were different outcomes associated with different relationships, right? Like not all mentoring relationships are going to be the same. And I think that that's truly the strength of this framework. It suggests that our relationships and their outcomes are going to vary, and it really depends on what two people are going to do together, not just whether or not they have a mentor that they ultimately can turn to. So finally, I want to complicate this final statement that describes mentoring as an important behavior. I can't stress this enough. I think mentoring is something that we all need, but I would strongly assert that it is not a behavior in and of itself, right? So let me offer an example. A few weeks ago, we were at the Association for the Study of Higher Education National Meeting in Las Vegas, right? And I was mentoring 3 women through the Council on Ethnic Participation. So we found each other, and we literally went into a room and closed the door, and I was mentoring them inside the room, right? If someone walked outside the door and said, well, what's she doing in there? And someone said, well, she's mentoring. Well, what does that mean? That could have been any number of things. I could have been consoling one of them who was crying about grad school. I could have been talking about how we're going to all do a group research project together. We could have been talking about any number of things, right? But saying that I am mentoring doesn't really say much at all, right? Mentoring is really about a series of behaviors that, as we saw on the previous slide, people are going to embody in very different ways. So if we moved, instead of talking about mentoring as a behavior, to a series of behaviors, right, that are based in why you're actually interacting, what your goal is, and how you're interacting, we might get a better read on how particular interactions are related to outcomes, right? So how can we apply these ideas to promote student success and inclusive excellence? I would assert that thinking about mentoring as relationships composed of different behaviors helps us reorganize our thoughts of what students may need most and what they need most when. So what you see on the screen is a framework I presented with Vicki Baker in a paper in About Campus that reconceptualizes differences in developmental relationships based on the behaviors you may find in each one, right? So when we talk about advisors help with specific tasks that are related to getting to degree completion, right? So they may help with you with course scheduling, compliance with rules and regulations, and you're largely dealing with a series of generalized exchanges, right? I'm helping you do something that will help you go off in the future to do something else, but I'm not expecting any direct benefit from that. If we're talking about mentors, they're different from advisors, right? Mentors are engaging in both direct and generalized exchange because there's a personal and professional component. So they may be helping you make decisions and things like that, but it's really about getting feedback on your work and your ideas, and really developing this personal relationship where an individual takes a personal interest in you and how you're developing. If you think about developers, right, they're engaging in all 3 forms of exchange. They're doing direct, generalized, and productive exchange. So there's the collaborative component, there's the personal component, and there's the professional trying to make strides towards completion component, right? So I think one of the things that's really notable about this is that I think we automatically look to the developer role and assume okay, we want everyone then to become developers, right? We need developers running around all over the place. And when I reflect on these particular different types of relationships, I think all of them are important in different ways, and it's really important, as the point was made earlier, that they don't all have to come in one person, right? You can get different things from different people, and that you have to have a network of individuals who are willing to serve all these roles. Right now, as a new faculty member at the University of Maryland, I think I'm a good mentor, I'm a good developer. I'm not the greatest advisor because I don't know all the rules and regulations yet, right? I need to figure those things out. And my new students who are coming in their first year need me to be a good advisor, right? I need to learn all those rules and regulations. My students who are a little bit further down the line need me to be a good developer. They need someone to collaborate with. So different students are going to need different things at different times, right? So if we think about our relationships in that way, as opposed to this student needs a mentor, I'm going to give them a mentor, then we might see a little bit more congruence in those relationships, right? So if we think about it in terms of the research that I've conducted, in the postdoctoral study, when we talk to students about who their mentors were or who they worked with, they often talked about their principal investigators of their laboratories, right? And they would really casually use the term mentor, right? They're like, oh, my mentor did this, my mentor did that. And a lot of times the behaviors that they described engaging in with these individuals they labeled as mentors sounded more like advisors, right? And for some folks that was okay, but some folks were really dissatisfied with that. And when they talked about what they really wanted, they wanted someone who was doing the mentoring behaviors, but they were talking about an advisor. Do you see what I'm saying? That can cause some level of dissatisfaction that is actually turning folks off from the academy and making them less successful, as opposed to being really clear about the different types of relationships in which they can engage. So if we look at research on faculty, we can also start to see how these ideas can promote faculty diversity, conversely. I conducted a study that was focused on faculty retention-related issues, examining how mentoring relationships were perceived as being related to productivity, right? Which I'm sure that I don't have to tell the folks in this room is related to advancement and promotion and all those other good things. So if we tease apart relationships, again, into behaviors, you can see how Black professors talked about how different interactions with students related to their outcomes in very different ways. So again, I was able to separate out their behaviors into direct exchanges, generalized exchanges, and productive exchanges. They rarely engaged in behaviors that looked like friendship or direct exchanges, but when they did, they didn't really see these behaviors as being related to their productivity. The big differences emerged when they discussed generalized and productive exchanges. Generalized exchanges, things like advising students' dissertations, helping them through personal problems, and tutoring, were seen as personally beneficial, but time-consuming and distracting. Productive exchanges, however, were seen as the most beneficial in terms of productivity, as one would expect, right? Collaborating on research and teaching allowed students to learn and faculty to reach their professional goals. No one said they were spending too much time in productive exchanges. Those who wanted to do it, wanted to gain access to it. They were looking for students to work with. Those who did it wanted to do it more. But participants wanted to spend less time in generalized exchanges and felt that Black faculty, and Black women in particular, engaged in these activities more than their peers did. So while generalized exchange is really important, the extent to which we can encourage faculty to consider how they can incorporate productive exchanges in their relationships in more thoughtful ways might allow us to better retain faculty, helping them reach their professional goals while continuing to support students and promote their success. All right, so what now? We're getting to the fun part where you guys get to ask questions and we get to engage in discussion. What do we do with all of these thoughts and ideas that have kind of thrown up on the wall at you folks? I would love for us to engage in some discussion about these ideas and how they could fit together moving forward, but there are a few thoughts that I'd like to leave you with before we do. First, I think that if we're going to bring discourses about faculty diversity and student success together, we have to have a really nuanced understanding of the challenges we face and the relationships between constructs. I think back to prepping for my exams in graduate school. We used to play this game where we'd put a lot of random topics on one sheet of paper, and we would try to draw lines between them, right, and talk about how they're connected to one another, mapping out how all these ideas can be brought to bear to address a problem or a question related to higher education. I think that this perspective and general idea can be valuable as we think about the problems our field faces in general. Faculty diversity and student success can certainly be studied on their own, but they're connected to each other in a variety of other areas, and the extent to which we identify the connections, the better we may be at developing solutions. Second, I would say that we must identify bridges that help us solve multiple problems at one time. I think that mentoring could be one of these bridges, but I'm sure that there are others. Further, as we can see in the case of mentoring, even when we think we understand something or see it as a good thing, we must take a deeper look and acknowledge its strengths and its limitations. And finally, I would encourage us to think more broadly about how we address issues in higher education and reframe conversations, moving from a paradigm of either or to both and. This isn't to suggest that there shouldn't be separate initiatives to address student success and faculty diversity, but it's to say that these groups may see more success that in addition to these individual initiatives, they also work together to achieve similar goals. So what does this mean in practice? In terms of research, I think it means that we must speak across areas of study more often. The scholars focusing on student success must collaborate and consult with those studying issues related to faculty diversity. We must develop studies, write, and think more about how we speak across topics and develop understandings of what is happening in higher education. Perhaps we could think about developing academic volumes or scholarly sessions that are intentionally multidimensional, examining intersections and shared interests between problems, in addition to our efforts to focus on addressing issues on their own. And in practice, both and means developing initiatives and institutional strategies that have multiple goals in mind. Are there ways to think about faculty diversity programs that explicitly identify goals related to student learning and success? Should we assess the success of our educational programs based on whether and how they may influence faculty diversity? Higher education leaders must continue to think creatively about solutions to problems, connecting multiple initiatives that might meet mutual interests and overarching goals. So thank you so much for your time and your attention, and I'd be happy to engage any questions or comments or engage this conversation further. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious to know what your thoughts would be about the role of the institution in terms of when they present program or the experience at a school, whether graduate or undergraduate, to students, and how they can better align it with realities of what they're going to find. You know, I currently work with Penn, and sometimes I think, we tell incoming undergraduates in this case, you can do anything you want, come to Penn. I kind of wish they would say, like, come to Penn, align your research goals with the faculty, you get more time. Don't try to start every new club, you won't get funding, and have a good time here. I think that in a way could help center students better about what they're expecting, and then probably be better prepared to experience a something that's going to be more in line with how they prepare for the real world, as opposed to saying, do whatever you want, because that's not how the world works either.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. I think about some of the work that I've done where students have talked about just that, like oftentimes too, around issues of racial and ethnic diversity on campus. So it's like the double-edged sword of having that diversity admin weekend, right? Like you bring all the students of color all at one time and they think like, this place is great. There are parties and there are people around and like I'm having a great time. And then when they really get here in the fall, they're just like, what happened to the parties and the people, right? Like, so we send them these messages that are like selling messages, right? We want students to buy our product. We want them to decide to come here. And and as someone who worked in admissions, I think I always was really thoughtful about what I was presenting and presenting the good, but also being realistic about what I was presenting, right? So as you talk about like the possibility of everything you could potentially do, what would be the benefit of thinking about a panel of students that wasn't only the rock stars who were doing all those things, right, who were like 2% of the student population, to having a panel of like just the average student, right? Like, what are some of the things that they experienced that were great? What were some of the things that were challenging? How do you actually navigate this space that has a lot of opportunities, right? But they're there on the shelf and you actually have to reach out and grab those opportunities. I think sometimes we present places as being perfect, right? And like they're all these things and they're all there for you and students arrive expecting that they will be showered with all these things, whereas they still need to make choices. They still need to be active agents in their own education. So I think somehow reframing that conversation so that we're talking about how students are active agents in their own education is just really important. Yeah.
Thanks again, Dr. Griffin, for an amazing presentation. So I was really intrigued by the kind of typology that you created for mentoring relationships, from advisor to mentor to developer, and even pushing back against the myth that mentoring is a behavior. So I'm wondering, like, I imagine that is in some way thinking that mentoring is essentially kind of an acquisition of knowledge or skill sets that that one could kind of learn to become a better mentor. But what is your thinking around if it's not simply a behavior, but it's more of a relationship? How do we prepare faculty members, or once they're already faculty members, to become better mentors or developers even? How do we get them to that point?
Sure.
Beyond the kind of behavior?
No, I think it's an excellent question. I inquired during my interviews with faculty members, like, so where did you learn to mentor? Like, where do you develop this skill? And invariably, there was some conversation about either their wonderful mentor that they had and what they did and how they try to translate that into their relationships with students, or that horrible mentor that they had and what they did and how they never would do that to students, right? While I think that that's a productive thing to think about, it still negates the importance of understanding what that individual student in front of you needs and actually tailoring your mentoring to meet their needs, right? We don't have spaces in higher education right now. We have an increasing conversation about having folks be better teachers, but we don't have this structured conversation about what it would mean to be a better mentor, right? Like, what would it mean to train somebody to engage in some of these different behaviors, right? And come up with a series of behaviors that works for them, right? So I don't think that everybody has to be a perfect mentor for every student, right? Like, it's our job to be good advisors for students. There are some students you're going to click with and like, yes, this is going to be my mentee, I'm their mentor, and we feel good about that relationship and we're going to figure that out together. I think that there are some students that you're like, I'm your advisor and I'm supportive of you, but we just don't click like that. But we don't have those types of conversations, right? So what can we actually do moving forward? We had a guest speaker in one of my classes the other night, and it was interesting. He was talking about teaching, but he was talking about like incentivizing folks to learn how to be better teachers, right? So he talked about money and all those other things, but he talked about how he frames his teaching workshops as, I'm gonna save you 20% of the time you spend prepping for class if you come to my workshop, right? And he's like, that gets people's attention, right? Like, I can be a better teacher and save 20% of my time. Like, yeah, I'm coming to that, right? So how can we reframe what a mentoring relationship could be? I think in our head, we often think of that like, I'm gonna spend all this time helping this student and I don't get anything, to, well, if you introduce a student to you and that benefit you can provide them through collaborating on something, and if it doesn't have to be research, it can be teaching, it can be any number of things that you feel like, okay, I'm able to spend time working with this student in a way that benefits me professionally, and then our personal relationship will develop from that. Like, that would be compelling. That might be interesting to somebody, as opposed to, I'm gonna teach you how to better manage a student's problems. Does that make sense? Yeah, Sean.
Great job,
Thank you.
Kimberly. I really enjoyed the talk. I thought it was incredibly thoughtful, very characteristic.
Thank you.
Um,
Very
so I like how you embedded in the talk several of your studies that you've done, but I want to engage one of them in particular. So it was the one where you talked about how faculty of color engage and advise and mentor students of color perhaps differently. And I think in one of the quotes there might have been sort of an implicit misunderstanding that these faculty members only care to work with students of color,
Yeah.
only care to work with black students, right? So I'm chairing 4 dissertations right now, and I've graduated 16 doctoral students,
Right.
chaired their dissertations, right? Only 3 of those 20 dissertations that I've chaired have been of
Students
white
of color.
students.
Oh,
right?
okay.
Only 3 of the
I thought it was the other way.
No. Only 3 of the 20 dissertations I've chaired have been white students. And to be fair and completely transparent, those 3 white students were given to me in a prearranged marriage kind of situation for the executive doctorate program where they don't choose their chairs, the chairs are assigned.
Yeah.
So, but Kimberly, I don't have a sign on my office door that says no whites allowed or
Right.
I don't want to work with white students. But only students of color seem to choose me. So could you maybe sort of talk a bit about like how have I managed to only get 17 people of color to choose me and the 3 whites were just given to me? I don't know. I just want to love to hear you say more about that.
Okay, so I think there are a lot of things going on, right? They think you're wonderful, Sean. So if we go to the root of doctoral education, right? We're talking about doctoral education. There's this apprenticeship model, right? You're studying with somebody who, in some ways, sometimes we're not trying to create mini-me's. Maybe a little part of us is, right? But somebody is choosing you based on this synergy that they perceive between your research and their research, right? So if it's not the same, they know that you'll get them. So I think there's something to people of color wanting to understand the experiences of people of color and looking around saying, who's studying people of color? Sean Harper is, I want to work with him, right? And that maybe some of your white students or some of the white students that might be enrolled in the program may not necessarily have those same research interests and feel that same sense of synergy like on an academic standpoint. I think just from a personal standpoint, that there is something that like you can't put a name on, you can't put your finger on, that the faculty in my study talked about, that students talk about, that I've experienced, that you just feel this different sense of commitment and understanding when you're sitting there with somebody who looks like you, right? Like I think there is something to the fact that I never envisioned myself as a faculty member until I met Sharon, right? Who actually looked like me, right? And was in front of a classroom and was dynamic and wonderful and all of these other things. And it wasn't that I hadn't had wonderful faculty members before. You saw what they looked like, right? Like I didn't see myself in them in the same way that I saw myself in her, right? Like I could tell her things and she would understand them. And I think that to some extent may draw students to you in a unique way. And I think too, the faculty members were very straightforward. Like they said, I was like, usually when I asked them a question about like working with students of color or working with black students, they almost all preface the comments with, I will work with anybody. I am happy to work with anybody. However, as a black woman, as an African American scholar, I have this commitment to my community. I want to see my community do well. So if I'm honest with myself, am I a little bit more concerned about my black students? Probably. Like, do I care about seeing them do well in a different type of like visceral way that I can't explain? Probably, right? So I think there are lots of different things happening all at once.
But Kimberly, when you say it that way, that actually sounds a bit racist, right? It sounds, right? Like,
I don't think it's racist. I think it's like the principle of, so the thing about, I think, pointing left, but that your mentor has to look like you, right? Like there's the principle of homophily. There's something that we are fundamentally resisting, that we want to be with, spend time with people who look like us, right?
White faculty do it.
White faculty members do it too. So when we're kids, it's gender. So girls play with girls, boys play with boys, right? As we get older, it's race and it's ethnicity. We want to be surrounded with people who look like us. That's who we feel the most comfortable with. So while we should engage across difference and there are all these other things going on, I think we're resisting some fundamental human principles that aren't necessarily bad things. Like, I don't feel like a student coming to me saying, Dr. Griffin, I was really excited to take your class because like, you're who I want to be when I grow up, right? Like you look like me, you wear your hair natural. I think it's so cool that you rock an Afro puff, right? Like, I think that's cool. I think that's okay. That like we need to see visions of ourselves and what we'd like to be, and it's okay that as a member of a community, I want to see members of my community do well. That doesn't mean I want to see other members of other communities do poorly. I have white mentees, I have black mentees, I have Asian mentees, right? Like I work with all of them, but I think to the extent that folks can be honest about like wanting to see members of their community do well, it kind of just is. I think it's being aware of it and making sure that you don't let that govern your behavior to the point that you exclude everybody else. Is that what's important?
All right, so one last question here. What happens, Kimberly, in the absence of faculty of color in a program or a department? When there are no faculty of color, but there are students of color, what have you found in your work? What happens?
I think I'd like to study it more in depth. I think what I've observed is that, so they're looking, they may then go out and look for that both professionally and personally, right? So they articulate to folks like, we need faculty members of color here because I need someone to do my work with, right? Like, especially if those students are interested in issues related to communities of color and they don't see that reflected in their faculty. It's like, I need someone to do my work with. I need you to bring faculty members of color here. They may want role models, they want professional connections. I think those students might feel some kind of way about it, right? Like, and they look for their networks outside of that institution. So I've seen students approach me from other campuses saying like, you know, you're the only faculty member who's doing the work that I want to do. When I look at my own faculty, it's not here. So can you serve an external member? Can you just have a conversation with me about my dissertation? Like, they're looking for folks who will validate their work, if that makes sense. And that's not to say that only faculty members of color can do that, but I think if we look across the board at what faculty members of color study, you know, like, I always tell my students, research is research, and I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean it in a, you are personally invested in the things that we've experienced, right? Like, it makes us want to understand them, and that in some ways that personal connection is what motivates you. So it's, again, you know, to some extent normal that we study ourselves. We study people of color in our experiences in higher education because we may perceive some kind of challenge there based on our own experiences. So students are looking for that too, I think, in their faculty. Thank you. Yes?
First, thank you for your great talk.
Oh, thanks.
I think that, as you said, all of us in different ways have had personal experiences with this. Something that I thought about while listening to you, though, is how another myth of mentoring I've experienced is that as a mentee and as a mentor, is that a lot of onus is put on the one person mentoring. Can you talk a little bit about like any of your experiences or maybe where you are right now in collective efforts with the faculty that you're working with, saying, okay, perhaps I will click better with this individual, but is someone supporting them? Is there a team effort? Is there some collaboration to address whatever specific numbers are, since we're making great efforts to recruit certain students? Are we making great efforts to somehow like devise a more systematized way that's not contingent upon one person serving as the main point person of an individual?
Yeah, I think it's really, really hard. The conversation, I don't know that faculty at any institution I've been at have had strategic conversations in that way, right? Like, I think I've been on the receiving end of those conversations. So folks asking me, you know, whether I had a mentor, whether I wanted a mentor and things like that. I think I resist the idea of someone trying to match me to somebody else. I always try to come up with some other word for that relationship. I think sometimes it has less meaning to call someone an advisor, but like, you know, I need a touchstone person, I need, you know, a buddy, whatever you want to call it, like someone to check in with that can, you know, again, do those general answering of questions things. But I don't know that I perceive specific strategies to make sure that students are like building that network of people. I think in my individual conversations with my students, you know, I try to make very clear from the beginning. I ask them like, what are you hoping to gain from this relationship? And, you know, what are some of your expectations? And here are the ways in which I feel like I can meet those expectations. These are the things I can do. These are the things I can't do or I don't do as well. So let's figure out who can help you with those things, right? Because you don't just need me, you need multiple people, right? Or even having conversations about your dissertation committee, right? Like, how do you choose those people? Those people all add something that, kind of puts together that mentoring picture, right? Like it's not one person provides one thing. Can you think of a series of experiences you need to have, or a series of things you need to be exposed to? And how then can you think about those experiences or those relationships that you want to build, as opposed to like, I need a mentor, right? Like I think for me, as particularly as a junior faculty member, I thought about my relationships that way. Like, who's really great to have conversations about manuscripts, right? Who's great to have conversations with about grants? Who do I talk to about service? Who do I talk about when I'm feeling crazy, right? Like, those are all different people. So just starting to think about it that way can be really helpful. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the talk. It's
Thank you.
wonderful. I'm curious about the care and feeding of mentors themselves, because you've got me thinking about these reciprocal relationships. And as a junior faculty member, I confess, even though I have the tenure, soar over my head, I feel very supported. I'm in this nice mentoring sandwich right now.
Yes.
So I mentor graduate students and brand new doc students and master students. I have a wonderful community of mentors, not just here at Penn, but in my
Elsewhere.
field more broadly. We have the Cultivating New Voices Among Scholars of Color, which is one of the most powerful mentoring networks, I would argue, in ed research. I mean, we have some wonderful mentors there. What happens post-tenure for people who are very senior in the field? Because I'm thinking about what happens once you are no longer that junior faculty member, and you are that senior faculty member expecting to pour out. One of the reasons why I think I've been an effective mentor, both as a teacher and as a new professor, is that I have lots of people pouring into me, not just here in the academy, but I have community ties, I have spiritual ties, I have neighborhood and family ties. So I just think about it as this distributed network. I can't, this sort of vertical relationship. I don't think human interaction naturally works that way. So can you speak?
Sure.
Can I answer?
Are you going to talk about stepping into the abyss, Sean? Because you look like you were having a moment. You're just like, let me tell you.
2 words. You drown.
Well, I mean, in some ways, you feel like there's no one there to help you anymore, right? Unless you're thinking about this now, which is the good news, right? There's no hope, right? Okay, so I like how you put it, the mentoring sandwich, right? So I refer to that as mentoring from the middle, right? So you have people who are pouring into you, you're starting to pour out. I think the one direction that I'm thinking about how to better leverage now is the peer mentoring that takes place, right? So I think as you kind of step off into the abyss where there's like no assigned person to you post-tenure, right? Or in some places you might have a person, right? And there's some structures that may be set up to start you talking about moving from associate to full and things like that. Like really it's my peers that are like one step ahead of me. So me calling Sean being like, yeah, what am I supposed to do now? Like they hired me and I have tenure, so I do what now? Like really relying on those peer relationships becomes important. And maybe it is time that you develop a new set of relationships with senior scholars, right? That maybe are where you hope to be in 10 to 15 years, right? I think we think of it more instrumental, like how do I get to tenure, not how do I become the scholar that I want to be one day, and that thought comes post-tenure, right? So you start looking at the field in a different way, like, oh, like I want to be like this person when I grow up, so how do I develop a mentoring relationship with them that's now strategized in a different way, right? It's not about how to get papers done and how to get them out. It's like how to manage your life and, you know, where should I be placing this paper and how do I become more visible? Like the questions are just different. And I think you have to seek different relationships. So again, it's that needing something different at a different time. Yeah.
So you mentioned this in earlier talk about how when people are trying to attain tenure, they're really rewarded most for research. So I was wondering if you saw in any of the institutions any examples of institutions rewarding mentoring in the same way for people who are trying to go.
Not a research university. Not a research university. The way that I recently presented to a group of international scholars, right, who had no conception of what like American tenure really was. And I presented it as like these 3 bubbles, right? So it's like, okay, so you have research, you have teaching, you have service, right? And at first they were equal bubbles. And then I resized them based on like what's paid attention to in tenure and advancement, right? So there was big research bubble, medium-sized teaching bubble, teensy little service bubble, right? If you want to grow that service bubble, that's fine. You just can't touch the other two, right? Like, so just because you grow that service bubble and decide, like, I'm going to engage in mentoring because it's what's important to me, it's part, you know, it's part of who I am. That doesn't mean that you can do less teaching. It doesn't mean that you can be a less productive researcher. You just have to open your arms a little bigger, right? And I think that's each individual scholar's level of decision making. You have to decide what's important to you. So are you willing to make that bubble bigger, knowing that you can't really shift the other two? Are you going to think about, you know, again, some of the strategies that I saw these faculty members engaging in that seemed like the most successful were, like in science, it's normal to have a research lab of students, right, who are all engaging on in your work with you. But, you know, in social science, it's not as normal to do that. But they were faculty members who were leveraging students in ways that really made sense, that allowed them to feel like, you know, they had time and they had attention and we could talk about the personal stuff, but like, how can we get this paper done? How can we get this presentation done? How can we get this poster done? I felt like those are the faculty members that really felt the most renewed by their relationships, as opposed to ones who were just really saw them as these unidirectional, like, I'm supposed to help. I can't really figure out, you know, how I'm supposed to incorporate students into my own work, so I'm just here to help, and that's really tiring, and I'm getting tired of doing that. So yeah, it's not so much a fundamental part of the reward structure as much as we might want to see it.
Kimberly, can you take a moment to maybe sort of racialize and gender those three bubbles? So you talked a bit about how the research, yours and other existing research, talks about how women and people of color sort of disproportionately take on this service bubble for which there is little to no reward in advancement processes. Well, why do they do that?
Oh, I think that's a good question. I think there are a few different things, again, that are functioning. I don't want to let people off the hook. I think there's some part of it, like when we really looked at women's narratives out of our faculty data set, they talked about wanting to do that kind of work and being committed to that kind of work. So it wasn't like, in some cases, we were completely like, you know, dragging them into doing some of these service commitments. For some folks, you know, again, when I think about myself and my experiences, I know I'm not here, or I know I'm here because I was mentored, right? And I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. So it is my responsibility to mentor. I'm not going to tell students no in that regard. I choose to do that. I want to do that. Like, I'm committed to that, right? So I think that's part of it, but I also think they're asked to and expected to in ways that are different from other folks, right? So if you are trying to draft a new strategic plan on diversity, shouldn't you probably ask the female and faculty members of color in your department? And aren't there probably just a few of them? And you know, if you're gonna have a search committee, yeah, the affirmative action policy says we need to consider diversity, so shouldn't we get the women and the faculty members of color to participate in that? You know, the students need mentors and they need role models. Well, they want the folks who look like them. Shouldn't we ask the, you know, female faculty members and the faculty members of color? I think in my dissertation at some point I looked at the student-faculty ratio on a campus, right? So at UCLA they might say, like, oh, the student-faculty ratio is 7-to-1, but very nice, go Bruce. So if you look though at the black student to black faculty ratio, it's like 1-to-40. Right. Or something like that, right? So it's not that if every black student wanted to work with a black faculty member, it's just beyond the student-faculty ratio. You just have this really skewed sense of volume, if that makes sense. Like, it just looks really different. So, you know, again, I think, so when I represented what, I did it again for like, okay, so this is what women's work life looks like, and this is what faculty members of color, based on the research, their work life looks like. And it's like, well, they've had to shrink that research bubble because these bubbles are bigger, right? There may be bigger teaching expectations, they may be bigger service expectations, but that puts them at risk in a way that other scholars may not be at risk. Yes?
I think to that point, I think that's why the numbers are really important, because if you do have a 1-to-40 ratio, like, who knows who you're going to connect with that faculty member?
Absolutely.
Right? So there's an assumption if you look like them that you're going to, people don't connect for so many reasons. So
absolutely.
If you only have 1 or 2 options or none, that's another piece of the puzzle that we have to try to solve.
Right, and I think, you know, that's part of the conversation with the students as well, right? That, you know, yeah, we have this homophily thing, right? There's this thing that we want to interact with people who are like us, but how do we redefine what like us means? So like us could be same research interests, like us could be same methodology, like us might be that we both like to play soccer, right? Like there can be a lot of different like uses that can keep you from like first sign of crisis, you run to that one faculty member who's the one faculty member of color in the department, or that one female faculty member in your program, and really kind of distributing what that picture looks like. But you're right, the other way to do it that we've been very poor at is actually increasing representation from those groups, so it's not everyone coming to one person. Yes?
Again, thank you for being here. So I recently finished my PhD, and
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Going into the PhD program, I really had no clue about academia, and based on my own experiences as an undergrad, I had no interest in an advanced degree, and things just kind of happened that I ended up in a PhD program, and I went through it. But I had a white faculty member, a white male faculty member as my advisor and subsequent dissertation chair, and there was one other black male faculty member who I initially, when I was looking for a PhD program, I said, this is who I want to work with. But I got this white guy, and I really wasn't sure necessarily in that relationship how it would work out. And even in our first meeting, he said some things that were slightly offensive. But part of my not knowing and understanding kind of the socialization process towards, finishing a PhD program, I really didn't know where the line was between an advisor and a mentor and a dissertation chair, and kind of how that line was blurred, and the political dimensions of me actually deciding, well, I don't want to work with you, I'm going to work with this another person. And I think so part of my challenge, and I'm hoping that you can kind of speak to how, particularly in cross-racial advisor relationships, mentorship relationships, what are some of the telltale signs for students of color when we connected intellectually, but personally, I didn't really know and didn't really understand the importance of mentorship really in socializing a student to really be competitive once that they finish a PhD program. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. In the workshops I've done, when I've talked with students about these relationships, I've presented similar ideas, right? That there are advisors, there are mentors, there are developers, and you need all three. So it's not a bad thing that you had this advisor that you connected with intellectually who was able to help you, but it seemed like there was something missing from that relationship that you needed, right? So telling students like it's okay to feel that way, and it's also okay that you can't get it from this one person, right? Like that's not the end of the world. It is not, a point of devastation that you cannot find all things packaged in your dissertation chair, right? It's very rare that people do. Some people do, and it's wonderful, and they have this long enduring relationship, and they talk about each other for decades and decades, and they continue to, I wrote a short article about these two individuals who have been friends for 50 years because one was the other's dissertation chair, right? But that's rare, right? So I think making it clear to students, there are certain things that you're going to need, despite the fact whether or not you have a personal relationship with somebody, you need someone who's going to understand you, understand your work, and give you good feedback, right? And if you don't have that personal relationship with them, not the end of the world, but you need to find it. Right? You need someone who's invested in you and your personal growth and your personal development. So that's when you start building that network that we were talking about earlier, right? So who's that person that you can go to who you want to talk about, okay, but I need to collaborate with somebody, and this is the direction I really think the work is going in, and I need to talk about this crazy that's going on in my life that's distracting me from my work, right? You need that person that you can talk with about that. You also need somebody who's going to connect you to a broader network of people and introduce you to other scholars who are doing the work that you want to do, right? So it's really important to, I think, acknowledge that that is common and not abnormal in the graduate student experience, right? That you're really going to have to think in constructive ways about building that network. Yes. Hi, it's nice to see you.
That's what I love to talk about a topic that is very much a part of administrative discussions, but until recently, a lot of them mentoring now.
Sure.
So, but I want to extend on 2 points, on 2 issues that have to do with socialization around mentoring for students. Because I think in my own division, teaching division, we say that you have a person to whom you are primarily assigned, you can work with everyone or anyone, and that's what you're saying. as well. And that has worked, well over time. But I've also kind of noticed something else in the past few years, not here in particular, but just generally, and it's kind of how do students, how might we talk to students more effectively and strategically about how to forge the kinds of relationships you just mentioned, because it can become an activity of just picking different people. Because some of those conversations that you talked about, it's just having a person who cares about you, and that person may or may not, be a mentor. And this comes up both in the academic institution, but it comes up in places like AERA, which now has a mentoring session in every division. Sometimes there are 5 people, sometimes there are 105 people. And what often happens there is that you are assigned, faculty members, I can use myself as an example, may be assigned multiple people, and I've felt that in many ways it has let the faculty members in these students' institutions off the hook. Because once I say I'm going to, I'm willing to, I'm going to do it. So it's, and so in some ways it's about kind of reframing and relaunching a way of thinking in the institution itself and academic institutions. But it's also creating a conversation about responsibility, both on the side of the faculty member and of the student. Because I think it's really complicated. You see somebody say, oh, he has a big research project. He has millions of dollars, I heard that he's very well connected. So I'll go and have a little time over there. And then I kind of like what so-and-so does, so I'm going to insert myself here. And then there's this other person over here who just seems kind of nice and has some interesting work, and I want to do that. And the reality also is that in one's professional career, you're not going to always be able to make those kinds of decisions. So anyway, my large question is, what ideas do you have? Because this is an issue that our faculty took up several years ago, around strategic and thoughtful socialization of students around those expectations, and also on the side of that.
Sure, I think it's really rare that we have thoughtful conversations like in a structured way about what it means to build your network, right? I often refer to it as like the developmental network, right? The different people you're going to meet at different points in time. So on the faculty end, I think to the extent that we really ask not only about advising, but about mentoring, like, so I would never expect a faculty member to be a mentor to all their students that they work with, but you gotta mentor someone, right? Like, I assume somewhere in there you're mentoring someone. So how are we assessing that, right? How are we assessing the extent to which faculty members are actually serving as mentors, either the students that are right in front of them, or those folks that are trying to build relationships with them externally? I think I would also speak to students in terms of in a structured way, like, okay, in the course of a professional seminar, right, students may ask, how do I build relationships with faculty members beyond this institution? How do I even begin to build relationships? First, like, yeah, knowing a whole bunch of people is nice, but it's not necessarily going to be, again, that network that's really going to move you forward as a student and as a scholar, right? If we take it back to that idea of social exchange, right, like, what are you giving? It sounds like you're making a lot of connections, right? You're taking. But what are you giving? And to the extent that you're actually giving and taking is going to make that person more invested in you. So if a student writes me and is like, well, are you interested in talking with me about my dissertation? I'll talk with you about your dissertation, right? Like, that's fine. Like, I'm not seeking you out to talk with you about your dissertation. I'll talk with you. That's fine. If you want me to be a part of your developmental network, what are we doing together that's going to advance us both? Right? So you can say, like, after that, like, yeah, well, I had a conversation with Kimberly GRIFFIN, and, maybe she'll write a letter for me or whatever. It's like, well, what kind of letter can I really write for you? How can I really vouch for you? I had a conversation about the work you're doing, and that's great, and I offered you a little bit of insight. But if you really want that person to be invested in you, right, that reciprocity has to happen. You have to give. They have to get something, right? Like, and not to speak in terms of, like, in a transactional way, but every
human exchange.
Yeah, and we only have so many days in a week and only so many hours in a day, and we have our own students, right? Like, I think getting students to really think, to be strategic, but not just strategic about how many boxes I can check off and how many people have I met, but what relationships have I built? What things have I put in place that are going to advance me in my career where I'm giving and receiving is a different way, I think, to think about it. It kind of goes, it's that middle space between I need one person to do everything for me, and I have a whole bunch of loose ties with a whole bunch of people, and everybody knows me, but I haven't really done anything with anybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really hard to imagine a topic that could be more timely or important for our community, so I think it should be March. As always, issues. Well, actually, I want to give you this. They told us when we made this poster that it was suitable for framing. And so we had it framed. We'll mail it to you. This is why, besides your own accomplishments, so many people came.
Thank you
So
so
thanks.
much.